Recently, a small-scale trade war broke out between Japan and South Korea after Japan restricted exports of chemicals necessary for making semiconductors. Boycotts of Japanese products erupted in Korea, and the once strong economic ties between the two trading partners seems to be in jeopardy. But where does this bad blood come from? To figure that out, we have to go back, way back in time, to the first major conflict between the two countries. Despite being neighbors for thousands of years, the first large-scale conflict between the two nations happened in the 1590s. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, having recently united all of Japan under one flag, set his sights higher, conquering China. In 1592, Toyotomi sent over 150,000 men to the port city of Busan, which they overtook within days. Within months, they were knocking on Seoul's door. By the time China got serious about Korea's request for backup, the Japanese had already made it to Pyongyang. The Chinese were able to push the Japanese back, but not entirely off the Korean peninsula. And Hideyoshi sent another invasion in 1597. The conflict was fought on Korean soil and lasted until Hideyoshi's death in 1598. Shortly thereafter, his advisors decided that his dream of taking over China and installing the Japanese emperor was a deluded pipe dream, and the war promptly ended. A few decades later, Japan would close itself off from the West for more than 2 centuries in a period known as Sakoku, or closed country. Japanese who were shipwrecked abroad or left the country for nearly any reason were forbidden to return to Japan. Some small-scale trade was allowed with the Dutch on the island of Dejima, off the coast of Nagasaki, which allowed a controlled amount of knowledge from Europe to enter Japan. The Chinese and Koreans were allowed to trade with less restrictive conditions. Korea sent embassies to Japan several times during this period, initially to ensure that Japan was not planning another invasion. During the Sakoku period, Korean potters played an important role in the development of the ceramics industry in Japan. Korea itself became isolated and only allowed the Japanese to enter a small area of the city of Busan for trade. Under this isolation, Korea would become known as the Hermit Kingdom. During the Hideyoshi invasions of Korea, Korea was the battlefield for a fight between two larger powers. Korea's geography, sandwiched between China and Japan, inevitably led Korea to re-emerge as a theater of conflict between its neighbors in the late 1800s. Following the forced opening up of Japan in 1853 by American Commodore Matthew Perry, Japan would embark on a massive modernization campaign under the Meiji Emperor, known as the Meiji Restoration. In an attempt to prevent Japan from being colonized by European powers, Japan sought to remake itself in their image. Japan rapidly industrialized and modernized its institutions and military following a Western model. In his book, The Making of Modern Japan, author Marius Jansen explains how Japan slowly gained power and influence. Japan sought to escape from unfair treaties imposed on it by imperialist nations. According to Jansen, Japan sought to impose similar treaties on Korea starting in the 1870s. Thus, by copying imperialist powers, Japan with time became one itself. Following a rising Japan's victory over China's declining Qing Empire in the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, the power dynamic in the region shifted considerably. In the wake of this victory over China, Japanese ambassador to Korea, Miyurogoro, plotted with radicals to murder the Korean empress in her bedroom on the night of October 7, 1895. The Russo-Japanese War of 1905 marked Japan's first victory over a European power, and the treaty that ended the war forced Russian interests out of Korea and cemented Japan's influence on the peninsula. Korea soon became a Japanese protectorate, and by 1910, Korea was annexed outright as a colony of the Japanese Empire. The legacy of 35 years of Japanese colonial rule still mars the relationship between the two countries to this day. On March 1, 1919, protests broke out in Seoul calling for Korean independence. The movement, known as the March 1st movement, quickly spread to other cities and lasted nearly a year before being brutally repressed by the Japanese authorities. Many Korean farmers were dispossessed of their lands and were forced to leave. To better administer their colony, Japan developed Korea's industry and invested in infrastructure such as transport and communication networks. The most damaging actions by the Japanese in Korea happened as the Second World War reached a fever pitch in East Asia. Korea was exploited for its natural resources such as coal and minerals. Millions of Koreans were forcibly displaced as they were drafted into the Japanese army or exploited for their labor. By the end of the colonial period, the education system was taught exclusively in the Japanese language and eschewed teaching about Korean history. The Korean language was forbidden in public, and the colonial authorities forced Koreans to adopt Japanese names. Using the fabricated Mukden incident as justification, Japan set up a puppet state in northern China called Manchukuo in 1931. From this moment, Japan began mobilizing its empire in earnest. In 1937, Japan decided to invade the rest of China and rapidly rushed south to Nanjing within a few months. This culminated in the infamous Rape of Nanjing, or merely Nanjing Incident according to the Japanese. If you're sensing a pattern in the different naming of events depending on who's telling the story, you're right on the mark. Due to the rape and other war crimes committed in Nanjing, the Japanese authorities decided that their military should provide the soldiers with prostitutes. Paradoxically, this led to widespread human trafficking of women from Korea and other nearby countries. The massive number of young women forced into sex work by the Japanese military would become euphemistically referred to as comfort women. Living in conservative Korean society, these women kept quiet for decades about what they had endured. The war ended after the horrific bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, resulting in Japan's complete and total surrender. The US occupation ensured that Japan restarted its economy and passed a pacifist constitution in 1946, which barred Japan from having a military. Japan reinvented itself as a peace-loving nation, and within 2 decades, it became an economic powerhouse. Korea split into North and South in 1948, and in 1950 the Korean War began, leaving millions of casualties and untold damage before an armistice was finally reached in 1953. A large Korean diaspora, referred to by the Japanese as Zainichi, has remained in Japan since the end of the war. The rights of the hundreds of thousands of Koreans in Japan to obtain permanent residency or citizenship has been another sticking point in bilateral relations. Despite societal discrimination, the Zainichi have slowly improved their socio-economic situation, with many fully assimilating into mainstream Japanese society. In 1965, Japan and the Republic of Korea re-established diplomatic relations. The Japanese foreign minister provided South Korea with the following official apology. In our two countries' long history, there have been unfortunate times. It is truly regrettable and we are deeply remorseful. Japan also provided South Korea with a generous loan to help with its economic recovery. For Japan, this treaty settled the debts of their colonial mistakes, but Korea saw the agreement as a starting point for future negotiations. In the context of the Cold War, both the former colonizer and colony became U.S. allies. They both relied on the presence of U.S. troops to ensure their security. By the 1980s, Japan was challenging the US economically, with its auto industry threatening Detroit with rapidly increasing exports to the US. Japan's economic development was spearheaded by the government policy of the MITI, or Ministry of International Trade and Industry. South Korea followed a similar state-directed model, and its economic success became known as the Miracle on the Han River. South Korea became a democracy by the end of the 1980s, holding its first free elections in 1988. Korea slowly caught up to Japan in economic development, joining the OECD in 1996. It is now considered a high-income country. A high point in the relationship worth mentioning was the joint hosting of the World Cup in 2002. Despite nearly 2 decades of improving relations since the 1965 treaty, controversy arose in July 1982 over new Japanese history textbooks. The textbooks in question glossed over the details of Japanese colonial rule in Korea, including referring to the March 1st movement as a riot. To put a lid on the anger of the Korean public, the Japanese Prime Minister agreed to provide schools with supplementary information on the subject. In 1983, Prime Minister Nakasone visited Korea, the first official visit since 1965. Since the 1990s, relations between the two countries have been plagued by two main issues. The first is territorial disputes, notably the Lion Court Rocks, referred to by the Japanese as Takeshima, but administered by South Korea, which calls the island Dokdo. More prominently, the ghosts of Japan's imperial past continue to negatively affect the relationship. The Yasukuni Shrine has been central to Japan's difficulty reckoning with its imperial past, the reason being that 12 Class A war criminals were secretly enshrined there in 1979. Ever since, every time a prime minister has visited the shrine, neighboring countries have reacted with outrage. A recent visit to the shrine by up-and-coming politician Koizumi Shinjiro suggests that this issue will continue into the future. For Korea, eclipsing these two controversies is the comfort woman issue. The women have slowly come out since the 1990s and spoken publicly about their tragic experiences during the war. Japan formally issued an apology in 1992 and set up the Asian Women's Fund to help their survivors. Still, the Korean public has largely found the Japanese official apologies to be lacking. As the women are getting older and starting to pass away, the comfort woman issue has taken on a new importance. A statue of a young girl representing one of the women was erected defiantly facing the Japanese embassy in Seoul. In August of 2019, an art exhibition entitled After Freedom of Expression, featuring a similar statue by a Korean artist, took place in Japan, but was quickly cancelled after threats from Japanese nationalists. In 2018, the South Korean Supreme Court ruled in favor of compensation of wartime forced laborers of Japanese steel companies. This was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back of an already tense relationship. In July of 2019, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry removed South Korea from its whitelist, thus complicating the export of chemicals necessary for manufacturing semiconductors. Japan has denied the political nature of this decision, but the timing is suspicious, and some have interpreted it as a weaponization of trade. This video is focused on the official government positions of each country regarding historical issues. There is a significant minority on the left in Japan that advocates for teaching Japan's history completely and recognizing the plight of the comfort woman with a complete apology. However, there is also a vocal minority on the right that wants to erase any mention of Japan's war crimes. The issue of Japan's apologies has certainly been politicized at times in Korea, but that does not take away from the real pain and horrific experience that the women faced during the war. Overall, public opinion of the other country has been dropping in recent years amidst high-level public disputes. So where did Japan and South Korea go from here? Their common ally, the US, has been more absent in the region since the beginning of the Trump administration. It is difficult to predict how US foreign policy may change. In the past few months, tensions seemed to subside as the world became engrossed by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, South Korea recently reopened a complaint against Japan to the World Trade Organization, so tensions could flare again. It's hard to see how these two governments can reconcile their clashing worldviews, given that they even disagree on the nomenclature of the sea geographically situated between the two countries. Younger generations are less tied up in historical conflicts and tend to appreciate each other's culture more than their elders. So perhaps the future is not so bleak. But looking at the big picture, the two countries are both democracies, and developed countries facing similar challenges like the rise of China and rapidly aging societies. If they were able to finally reconcile past wounds, perhaps they could tackle these huge issues together. The point of this video isn't to make Japan look bad, or to make anyone out to be the victim. It's to look at the past objectively, to better understand the stakes in the relationship for each country. I hope that you've come away from this with a better understanding of Japan-Korea relations. Thank you.